the last thing I would say on shame and guilt and all of that is there's not a family out there who doesn't have something. I mean, everyone has a crazy uncle, right? Everybody. It's kind of like going to the doctor and someone points to a rash in an awkward spot and they feel embarrassed and the doctor's thinking, I saw 20 of these this week. They don't care. In the same vein, if you tell me your uncle once did a weird thing in Vegas, it's not our place to judge, and we've probably heard something similar before, so no worries.
At the end of the
Yeah.
day, we're all human.
There are only so many unique experiences a
Yes, the
person can
order and
have.
combination of them is always unique, like shuffling a deck of cards.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Andreea Parc.
And I'm Alexa Dumitru.
And this is Alive.Again podcast. It's a podcast where attorneys and other professionals meet to discuss real life challenges and how our decisions shaped our journeys. Our guest today is Luke Palder, founder of Memoir Ghostwriting.com, proofreadingservices.com, and translationservices.com. He is committed to enhancing communication through the written word across different languages. His passion lies in empowering writers to share their stories, assisting businesses to overcome language barriers, and enabling individuals to immortalize their spoken words in written form. Thank you so much, Luke, for being here with us today. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the very flattering introduction that I hopefully will live up to.
I would like to mention that you were referred to us by the wonderful Elizabeth Katz, who was one of our guests a couple of months ago, right? Yes, and she is a very alive 78-year-old. She was nice enough to refer you to us. And it's wonderful to see how many things you're doing.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm an author myself. I wrote my memoir and it's translated into 3 languages. And it's wonderful that you can do this all under the same roof.
If we hold memoirghostwriting.com aside for a moment, proofreadingservices.com, translationservices.com, transcriptionservices.com. It's a very lame way of naming businesses, I might add, but it tells people, what we do. If you look at those 3, they're far more similar than immediately appears. Often it's take an input, modify that input, check the modification, ship it back. Memoirghostwriting.com is a logical extension from the world of proofreading and editing, and I can explain sort of how it came into being, but that's the one that sits slightly outside of those other 3. And I always like to be as transparent as possible. Obviously, transcription and translation have changed enormously over the last, let's say, 2 to 3 years with the advent of AI. So our focus is largely proofreading, editing, and assisting people with self-publishing and all the services that go with that. And then memoir ghostwriting, which is a much higher touch. We do still do transcription and translation, but the nature of those industries has changed where, for instance, with translation, a lot of the work these days is in modifying AI produced work, improving it, or in languages that AI is frankly terrible at. So, Cherokee, Cheyenne, all of these things that it might take AI a little while to get good at.
Yeah. Even Romanian. I'm Romanian and I wanted my book to be translated into Romanian. And I had to hire a local publishing house to help me edit the text in Romanian because although I graduated law school in Romania as well as in the US, but my Romanian is not that highly, and AI was a mess.
It has its place. I often say that it does, and this is, 2025? A month from now, a year from now, who knows? But for certain things, it helps you go faster if you know what to look for. It helps you get prices lower in the world of translation. For instance, if you're a media group, you can't reasonably pay for translation at scale, but you can certainly pay for people to do a final check. The initial output of AI, you sort of have to calibrate expectations, right? Is it going to be a B minus, a B plus? And for certain use cases, that's phenomenal. For a lot of other use cases, you do still need that final polish. Years from now, who knows?
And how do you go about that? Because AI is not that good, and in a language like Cherokee, for example, how do you go about fixing what AI gave you, or do you just, is it easier to go from scratch from English to Cherokee?
Yeah,
How do
so
you go about that?
with ghostwriting, we use zero AI right now, with the rare exception of photo modification. Like if someone were to send us the only photo they have of their great grandparents and it's yellowed and water damage, fire damage, there's a lot we can do now that we couldn't do a year ago. But even with transcription under the ghostwriting banner, because we have to transcribe all the interviews that we do, we actually still do those manually, which sounds a little wild, except by the time we go through, take like Eastern European Jewish heritage, by the time we go through and correct the spelling of all of the Ukrainian cities or Belarusian cities, we spend pretty much as much, the same amount of time as if we modified the AI input. So we've decided internally that we're going to take those through 5 steps of polishing. The first listen, second round of polishing for proper nouns, review by the client for clarification and redactions, and then final proofreading. With something like Cherokee, so in the translation world, it is wonderful when you have a member of your staff who knows the language, right? So you've built up that trust and you say, hey, I trust them to honestly and ethically assess the quality of what's been done. But most of the time for niche languages, what we end up doing is having either 2 or 3 people, depending on the structure of the project, go through the different steps. So translator, verifier, proofreader. And that allows us to sort of, if we're having them work independently, check each other's work. We do this all in a project management tool where everyone can see the feedback that's been given. So people's sort of names and reputations are on the line with respect to, did they do good work? But that's typically the way we, will approach something like a very small language. We can actually only find, one speaker of a language. So I think we did a Seneca project. I think Seneca, I could be wrong, but from memory, I think it's like 110 speakers. Google tells me fewer than 50 fluent native speakers. Often what you find is that within those communities, even though there might be 50 fluent speakers, there's 1 or 2 that's like the go-to in the community. So every Seneca request that comes in finds its way to the same person. And so you might not actually have like, a Seneca number 2 person. So in those cases, we basically communicate with the client and say, hey, these are the parameters of reality, right? There's the one guy, he's done it for pretty much every organization for the last 20 years. It's him or it's him. Yeah, Romanian, though, has a lot more options.
Yeah.
And who are those books for? If there are 50 people, I mean, obviously they need books in their language, of course, but I'm thinking, do you have more use cases of that language, for example, in like smaller, like if somebody's quoting somebody else in English books, for example?
I think I understood what you're saying. So most of what we ghostwrite, well, there's sort of 2 buckets. There's either that which is private, so it's really just for the family. It's to take the legacy and learnings and wisdom, and particularly the things that are going to disappear with that individual. We never sell across those lines because it feels dirty and unethical. But in the back of people's minds, we know that whatever information they have about their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, no matter how small, if they don't write it down, it's going to disappear forever, and those who come after them won't be able to benefit from it. So those are the primary goals of a private book. For the public-facing books, the main buckets of why people do a public-facing book are generally one of, I think it's 4-ish things. They either want to start a consulting practice or raise their consulting rates, start a speaking tour or raise their speaking rates, serve on a for-profit board, sometimes correct the record. If there was someone has already told their side of the story, now they want to tell theirs. Sometimes they want to scratch an itch that they just want to know that their story is down forever. Those are sort of the 5 main buckets of why a public-facing book. There are times when we do translate those books, but the translation part is generally independent of the ghostwriting part. That being said, there are often translation components in the other direction. So someone will say, hey, I've got 30, 40 boxes of stuff in my basement. Can you guys go through it, figure out what's important, what we might want to include? Could be photos, documents, etc. And we come across stuff all the time. First, we have to identify what language, what time period, and then we have to find someone to translate, that so that we know if it's important or not.
That's super interesting. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, you are a fairly young person. Why did you choose to focus on the older people, preserving their journeys, their stories, their legacies?
Well, one, I love being called young. I don't always feel it, so thank you. Two, so I would like to say I woke up one day and said, memoir ghostwriting is, I know that's the thing. Now I get to wake up every day now and truly, do my life's work, meaning I am proud of what we do. I'm happy to do it. I see the joy that we provide to people. It's a good business model, which doesn't hurt. So I love what I get to do now. But if we rewind 14 or 15 years ago, the business that I started then was a calculation. And so what I mean by that is I looked at all of the services categories that were sort of in existence at the time, mostly things that were web-based. I wrote 5 or 6 questions that I wanted those services to satisfy. How long is the sales cycle? How competitive is it to rank on Google? What's the customer lifetime value? For instance, data entry contracts can be enormous. They can have very thin margins, and the sales cycles, at least back in like 2011, could be as long as like a year or a year and a half. Of the 70 or so that I started with, I boiled it down to about 4. Number 1 was a transcription company. Number 2 was a proofreading company. And basically I started those up. What ended up happening is probably about year 4 or 5 on the proofreading side, I realized in conversation with clients that we were solving a corner of the problem. So we've had about 27,000 clients at Memoir or at proofreadingservices.com. And I'd say about 4,000 of those were authors, and about 1,200 of those were memoirists. The memoirists just kept coming to us and saying, I've spent 6 or 7 years writing my memoir. Can you guys edit it? And we said, absolutely. We kept saying 6 or 7 years is like 5 or 6 years too long. We also figured that for everyone who approached us with a complete first draft, there were probably 99 other people who started and never got to that point. Internally, we said, look, we've got the writers, the editors, transcriptionists, formatters, designers, proofreaders, line editors, developmental editors, copy editors. Let's just solve the bigger problem. And so we started saying to people, hey, we can actually just write your memoir. When we realized there was traction there, we spun it out as a separate brand. The 2 things I didn't anticipate is that it'd be extremely enriching work. I love what I get to do. And that the number 1 comment that we get from people, particularly those in their 80s and 90s, we actually have, I think, 6 or 7 clients in their 90s right now, is that it's a lot more fun than they ever anticipated. So we get to help walk through their entire life story, skipping over the stuff they don't want to talk about, and focusing on the turning points, the most important people, the happiest memories, how they became the people that they became. At the end of the process, they're left with something that they're really proud of and we're really proud of.
If I can be honest, and hear me out for a second, when I initially heard of ghostwriting, to me it was an initial traction for me, where I didn't quite understand why. And I told my mom, I was like, well, if I pick up a book by George Clooney, I would hope it would be written by him. And now as you're explaining it, I'm realizing that I didn't understand at all what it was. And that because the human mind is, we forget a lot of things. Important things, whatever it may be, if you tell us to recite our life story, we're not going to remember a lot of things. But the fact that you are doing that research and going into these people's lives through boxes and their life in their home, it's really interesting that you are able to tell the stories that they may not remember. How do you deal with people who may have that initial traction to that word ghostwriting?
So I really appreciate it. Personally, I think this industry is way more opaque than it needs to be. I mean, ghost is literally in the name. So, right away, we set aside all the stuff that is just categorically unethical, academic work and stuff like that. So, we've never written and never will write anything academic. We do have certain parameters where we say, hey, we're not going to write that ever. Somebody else will, I'm sure, but it's not going to be us. The two that come to mind, because they've come up a couple of times, there's anything medical that, doesn't have an MD or DO at the end of the person's name. So if someone wants to write something that is not rooted in science, we say that's not for us. I'm sure someone else will write it. It's not going to be us. The second is anything overtly racist or sexist or anything like that. We say, not for us. We wish you well as a person, on your merry way. Within that, though, we always remind ourselves that it's not our book. And so we do write things that we might not agree with, and we write things in a manner that we wouldn't do ourselves. That second bucket is more in line with what you're talking about here, because our goal is to reflect the voice and content from the individual in place to ensure, hey, is this the story you've always imagined? So at the outline phase, when we've taken all the transcripts, we fit them to an outline. Our outlines are pretty beefy. They're 20, 25 pages. We say, is this the book you've always imagined? Chances are on the first go, it's about 80% of the way there. And then we sort of massage it until it's 100%. At that point, we go off and we say, we're going to write the first draft. What we actually do is write the first chapter. We take it back to them. We say, does this look and feel like it came right out of your mouth? And this is sometimes where people get a little confused. They didn't write it, but they sort of did. And what I mean by that is we're going to do all the heavy lifting, but all of the content's going to come from them or their orbit, maybe a journal they had 30 years ago. So it's not us putting ideas in their minds, in their mouths. And what I'm dancing around here is an analogy that my team hates, but I think it does get the point across. It's kind of like remodeling a kitchen, where the client's going to come with a vision, and you're going to say, okay, I'm going to bring in the electrician and the plumber and the demo guys all at the right stage, in the right order, to ensure we get to where we need to go. And so in that scenario, I'm sort of like the general contractor. I'm pulling in the right people for the job. Do they want steel, tile, or something? But the point being is we're trying to accomplish two things: capture their content and help them get their voice into written form, and finish. I am of the idea that if we get someone to 98% and not 100% of the way through the process, then we have not delivered the majority of the value. Maybe there's some peace of mind if they shove it in a safe deposit box. They say, okay, the stories are there, but I want to help them get all the way to the point where they are proud to sit in a bookstore and sign it in front of friends and family. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into it that is helping people do the heavy lifting so that it can come into being. I'm sure that there are ghostwriters out there who might suggest to certain celebrities, hey, maybe we stretch the bounds of truth here. That is not what a good ghostwriter should be doing. A good ghostwriter should be reflecting the truth while also making the not sexy sexy. And what I mean by that is sometimes when people are positioning themselves for, say, a for-profit board or consulting, the most valuable thing that they've done in their life in a business capacity is frankly really boring. We need to find a way to make it sound interesting so that it has a wide enough audience to get them where they want to go. Great example is, if you're a regulatory expert, if you know how to move a drug through the FDA, that is objectively kind of boring. It's really important to all of our lives. And you can find the human side of it. You can say, this is what the process was like. This is what they went to bed thinking about every evening. Were they thinking about how this is going to affect people's lives? Or were they thinking about my shareholders are going to be pleased? All right, we're going to lean on the side that is more interesting and brings a bigger audience, knowing that the audience has to connect with it, even if the ultimate goal is for them to, say, sit on a for-profit board.
We had so many guests that initially they said, well, I don't have an interesting life. I don't have anything to share. I don't have a story. My life was boring. I don't believe in that. I believe that every person has a story, every person went through things, but what you're doing is that you're helping people express what maybe is just locked in their mind and they don't even want to share it with the world. That your service exists and you can take people's ideas from their head and put it down in words.
I agree wholeheartedly. Obviously, I recognize my own bias in saying that everyone has an interesting story, but I have never found evidence to the contrary. And the two examples I always go to are this 93-year-old woman who we've had the pleasure of supporting, who essentially said, "What about my life is interesting? I taught kindergarten for a couple years and I raised 5 kids." And I said, "Ma'am, no one has raised 5 kids and doesn't have phenomenal stories." And sure enough, as we helped her reminisce about important people and trials and tribulations, there was so much meat there that it's on the longer side of what we normally do. And then the other example I always give is, you're sitting there in Queens. The same thing is true in DC. When you get in a cab and you just start chatting with the driver, every single time that person has a phenomenal story. Do they wake up in the morning and say, "Hey, my story is phenomenal"? Probably not. But I think 2 trips to DC ago, I was in a cab and I saw a flag that I didn't recognize hanging from the mirror there. And I asked the gentleman where he's from, and he said, "The Gambia." And immediately I thought to myself, how do I make this ride like 3 hours long? Because you're probably the only person from the Gambia I will ever meet in my life. And I have so many questions. So I'm completely with you. I firmly don't believe, even though I recognize that I'm biased in saying this, that there are dull lives out there. As well, part of the challenges of ghostwriting is to find the exciting parts, find the joy and the happiness. So a little bit of it's on us too. If the content is boring, then we probably didn't dig deeply enough.
People write their memoirs probably just to put their story out in the world. But I think that the niche you're doing with telling their stories for their families only, that is wonderful. Because I am also, among other things, a psychogenealogy practitioner, and I help people write their family tree. And even with us, we were wondering, I have my parents alive. Unfortunately, her grandparents from her dad's side passed away. And we don't know a lot of things from that side of the family. So that is wonderful to be able to combine people's lives for the generations, to know who their ancestors were.
We definitely are sort of the cousin of genealogical firms, right? So we do partner with a great firm out of Utah. A fun fact is that a lot of the world's best genealogy firms are out of Utah because the Mormon Church has great records and people grow up with learning some of those skills and then realize those same skills can be applied outside of a Mormon lineage. And so there are phenomenal genealogical firms all throughout Utah. Where we sort of come in is helping them track down those seeds of genealogy. So things that could be helpful, but are not immediately actionable necessarily. So, a 90-year-old might tell us, I'm thinking of a gentleman from Syria, might tell us that his family home was right by this huge mountain range, but he doesn't remember exactly where. That's the kind of thing where with enough digging, you can come up with some plausible guesses. River, mountain range, okay, we've got 2 or 3 places to look now. But without sort of asking those questions about what did you do when you were 5? And he says, okay, I went hiking at the base of this mountain. Without getting those little snippets and tidbits and facts, it can be a lot harder later. We can always take that body of information, hand it to the genealogists, and they can do phenomenal things with it. A great example, too, is architecture. When people describe their childhood homes, depending on where they're from, that can help us narrow down to certain regions or towns or deduplicate towns. So with my own genealogy, one of the things the genealogists had to do is figure out which of these similarly named cities or really towns my ancestors were from. There were 3, and we had to basically say, hey, these in the records, this is spelled a certain way, but because it's transliterated or in some cases translated, we don't actually know until we put together all the context clues. Our work definitely feeds into genealogy, even though there are people who I will readily admit do the genealogical part way better than we would do internally, and that's why we connected with some outside groups.
What did you want to
Oh,
be
I'm
when
going to
you
throw you
grew
for a
up?
big loop here. Uh,
I can
uh,
imagine.
in short, an astronaut. I was a math and science kid all through all of those early years. Then, when I was about 14 or 15, I sent myself to military school in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. I was one of two schools at the time where you could learn how to fly. That's what I thought I wanted to do. The two things that changed that are one, by the time I was done with that school, and I enjoyed it quite a bit, I said, I don't really want to go to the service academy. We literally wear the same uniforms. I think they have the same uniform supplier. Like I'm done with marching to breakfast. I'm good. And two, when I got my pilot's license, the examiner word for word said, I think I was 16 or something. He said, "You're a pilot. You're not a good pilot, but you're a pilot." And I thought, all right, maybe not the thing for me. But I was a math guy all through high school and all that. I still really love math. I've got it. Give it a shout out to this book, but the New York Times Book of Mathematics and a bunch of others over there that are just a good read. But yeah, when I pulled myself off the service academy track, I sort of took myself off the astronaut path as well. I was fortunate to go to Yale for undergrad, and they were extraordinarily supportive of all my newfound interests, but was not one of them at that point.
Literature and math are a little two sides of a
They
spectrum.
absolutely, honestly, and ethically say every day that I hire people a lot smarter than I am. Uh, and that means, I have full confidence in all of our writers and editors and proofreaders. I know when a bunch of our proofreaders want to debate whether or not there's a space on the side of an EM dash in Chicago Manual Style 18 versus 17, that what they conclude is the truth, and I can roll with that.
I read on your website that you have worked with a lot of well known, famous people. What did you find as a common denominator in all of these people, their memoirs?
So it's a great question because it's a lot of them say essentially the same thing toward the end of their life. A common client for us is about 85 years old, hopefully in great health, though sometimes we do sort of expedited versions, with the backdrop being that we don't know how much time the person has left. The common denominator in broad strokes is definitely relationships. It's who you surround yourself with informs the quality of your life. So, it's maintaining friendships, it's finding a great life partner. And the only core divergence from that is in these punctuated moments where life could have been very different. So I'm thinking of a gentleman who at the time we spoke with him was in his mid 90s, and he talked about his time as a soldier and his sergeant taking his fist on a late night patrol and sticking it right in this gentleman's abdomen and stopping him from stepping on a landmine that he didn't see. What's stunning about that is this was almost 70 years later, and despite this gentleman having had a lovely long marriage, it would be hard to argue that that sergeant wasn't, through one lens, the most important person in his life. Because all of the joy and happiness that came after, that we had all this great time discussing and making sense of, can be traced back to this person whose name is almost irrelevant to the poetry of the moment. So there are these grand relationships that we have and we try to maintain, loved ones, etc. But then there are these punctuated instances where everything can or almost did change. Selfishly, I love finding them because not only do they help someone make sense of sort of the fragility of life, they also make for a great read, right? When the bullet almost hits you, but it doesn't. You didn't catch the train and you met your partner. All of these things that, you can choose to be frustrated by missing your train, or your life can go in a completely different direction. I studied abroad and submitted the paperwork at the last second, and met my wife on that study abroad program, which is unequivocally the most meaningful thing that's ever happened in my life. It's those kinds of things where we don't realize the magnitude, gravity of what's happening until we reflect on it. Pretty
The
much, yeah.
butterfly effect.
The flip side of that too is because there's so much we don't control in life, there's this sort of binary proposition made to individuals that we can either freak out about the fact that we don't control a lot, or we can say, well, if I don't control it, I'm just going to sort of navigate with being comfortable with happenstance. So easier to say than remember in real time. But now that I have a couple little kids and a lot of my days are filled with, euphemistically, I'll say happenstance. I'm thinking more like, rushing out the door and a kid throwing up on you. Sometimes you try to find why that could be a good thing. It's not always easy, but why it might be a good thing. Maybe you get an extra moment with your kid and you enjoy it, or you decide, look, we're not doing school. We're going to go get a coffee and a cake pop and just press pause on the day.
Just go with the flow. And
everything happens for a reason.
And I have this belief that everything happens for a reason, but it all happens for the best.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said. So I'm probably doing a bad job of characterizing his research, but there's a Harvard psychologist named Dan Gilbert who researches among what he calls synthetic happiness. So that the happiness we use the word fabricate for ourselves, but there's a huge asterisk next to that, because what his research shows is that the happiness that we momentarily fabricate for ourselves, we tell ourselves, oh, I wanted it to be this way, or it's better off this way, is, as I understand it, as physiologically, according to his research, valid as the happiness that we generate in other parts of our lives. So when we tell ourselves those things, it's a way of momentarily making sense of maybe a lost opportunity. But his research shows that we can almost create the thing physiologically that we spend our whole lives chasing, which is, to me, kind of stunning and a bit refreshing.
No, it is. The interpretation is really good. What would be one thing that you want our listeners to live with after this conversation?
So, coming at it from the perspective of ghostwriting and memoir and all of those things, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot for a moment and say that, I love a beautiful memoir. I love the narrative arc, the character development, the photos, the captions, everything. But most people shouldn't think about any of that. All they should think about is capturing the stories, and then you can do whatever you want with it later. So often people get overwhelmed by what does it become, how do we present it, and none of that's really important. You can solve it later, or you can exist with it in just sort of transcript form or recording form. And then they get sort of overwhelmed by, where do I start? The two things I always want people to know is start anywhere, just start. So, if it's the story you've heard 1,000 times from your parents, maybe it's that cocktail party story they always tell, or the road trip story that always changes a little bit, but is, at the core is still there and it's still funny. Just get a recorder and record it. It is much easier, obviously, for us to do that than for families to do that, because we come with impartiality, structure, a plan, all of these things. But just start. What you get is better than getting nothing. And the second thing, even with our work, where we aim for comprehensiveness, I always remind people that we're really aiming for 97 or 98%. And the reason I don't say 100 is when I do, a certain subset of the people we have the pleasure of supporting freeze up and are paralyzed by trying to track down that one photo that might be in the storage facility somewhere, and feel that if they don't find that photo, they haven't done the full job. And so aiming for, almost perfect in terms of comprehensiveness is way better for everybody than absolutely perfect. If you wind that logic back quite a bit, just getting something is better than nothing. I don't know if either of you ever saw the SNL bit, Coffee Talk, the sort of elderly.
Vaguely
for
familiar.
The listeners, it's great. I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere, but it's these sort of a caricature of these elderly Jewish women in look, in voice, and all that. And I think it's Mike Myers, and they got really distinct voices in this bit. I always use that as an example of when audio can be better than writing, because I have a couple voicemails saved from my great aunt who was pretty much one of those women. I mean, this remarkable voice. Those are so precious because if we wrote it, it'd be good, but that particular bit has to be in her own voice. And so get a recording out, start somewhere. If you need help starting, obviously we would love to, and all of those things I'm supposed to say. But even going to ChatGPT and say, if I only have 30 minutes to ask 5 of life's most important questions, what should they be? That's a great start. And then the last thing I would say that's related to this is if you are writing anything at all, a book, important essay, just back it up, back it up, back it up. It's the first thing I say to anyone who I have the pleasure of talking with who says, I've been working on this for 8 years. And I say, before we do anything else, is it backed up? And every fourth person, making that number up, but it's probably about right, says, oh no, I don't think it is. And I said, let's stop this conversation, go back it up, and then let's resume. Because all it takes is, one bad fire or a computer to short or something like that. And it's just blood, sweat, and tears in document form, and I never want that to happen to anyone.
And I had one question that I didn't ask you that was, to me, interesting. People go through entire lives with shame and guilt and pain. How do you take them out of that? Because I know that everything is in life is perspective. How do you take them out of that shame so they can speak about it and put it into words?
I always joke that we are wildly unlicensed therapists. We don't actually provide advice. We never judge. We support people whose opinions differ than our own. Our goal is a great story. The first thing I always tell people is that autobiography and memoir are cousins. They're often conflated as the same thing. With autobiography, the expectation is that you're including pretty much everything. With memoir, you get to choose what you want to include, and you get to put your thumb on the scale of what's important. We always tell people we can and regularly do skip over whole parts of their lives. We do so gracefully in text, so it's not jarring to the reader. Sometimes they're not even aware. We often skip over divorces. We skip over major losses. And the other thing about sort of shame, guilt, or even just sad events is that often people really do want to talk about those things, but not yet. And the beauty of an extended process with one of our team members is generally we do around 12 interviews, and we find that by interview 6 or 7, things that people didn't necessarily want to talk about early on come back up. We're always gracefully sort of skirting the boundaries of things that are in that gray area because we want them to feel free to talk about those things. But we want them to know that we can gracefully skip over anything they don't want to. And we've taken that to extremes before when people had whole sections of their lives, they said, that's nothing I want to discuss. The other things we can redact, the most common thing we redact is when people name their favorite grandchild. It happens all the time, like totally accidentally, but it happens like if they're in their 80s and have grandkids, it's like 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 times completely by accident. And it's often just the grandkid that they saw last and have a great memory of. So like, it's nothing deeper. It's just, hey, I saw Judy and we had cheesesteaks for lunch and it was wonderful. We can also like embargo things until a date, right? So sometimes people take what we've done and they stick in a safe deposit box and they say, that's where I want it to live. I don't really want to have these discussions, but I want them to know that this is why I did what I did. In rare cases, for public figures who want to keep things, they want their private life to be private. And that's not to say there's anything salacious or they're just a public figure who's become private. Sometimes we will encourage them to donate copies of their books to their university library. Some libraries, programs where, 75 years after their death, the librarians get to open the boxes and go through their papers and memoirs and such. And so that's another way of sort of, if your life has intersected with sort of the halls of power, if you will, that's one way of saying, I don't really want to do the dance of a politician while I'm around, but I have some great stories around, this president or that president that I would like the world to know. I want to be long gone when that's happened. And so that's something that some of our clients entertain. And the last thing I would say on shame and guilt and all of that is there's not a family out there who doesn't have something. Everyone has a crazy uncle, right? Everybody. But when it's kind of like going to the doctor and someone points to a rash in an awkward spot and they feel embarrassed and the doctor's thinking, I saw 20 of these this week, they don't care. In the same vein, if you tell me your uncle once did a weird thing in Vegas, it's not our place to judge, and we've probably heard something similar before, so no worries.
At the end of the day, we're all human, so...
There are only so many unique experiences
Yes,
a person
the
can
order
have.
and combination of them is always unique, like shuffling a deck of cards, right? But you're exactly right. There are, unless you were, I don't know, skydiving on a giraffe or something. I haven't heard that one before, but like, short of that, lots of people skydive, lots of people climb Mount Everest. It's not lots and lots and lots, but it's enough that it comes up more than once.
And now the question that is a staple question for the podcast, and I ask every guest: what is one activity in your life that makes you feel more alive?
It is tough with little kids, but as cheesy as it sounds, so I have 2 little boys, and all of the stereotypes that come with that. Everything in our house is broken. All like we were gonna paint our walls when we moved in because there were some scuffs, and now I can tell the exact height of my boys by the array of scuffs on the wall. So there's a lot of chaos and madness in our house. They're lovely and I love them and all of those things. The thing that brings me the most joy now is these little moments where these slightly older kids act like their younger selves. So you get the 2-year-old to actually remain still. He started telling, just in the last couple of weeks, what we call once upon a time stories, where as he's going to bed, he'll just kind of mutter to you the line once upon a time, and then, a 1-line nonsensical story. And that's the whole story. But if you can get that for like 5 minutes, it's really heavenly. The problem is, 24 hours minus 5 minutes, the rest of the day, he's all over the map. But I would say at this point in my life, finding those little snippets of one-on-one calm with one of my boys makes me feel quite alive.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. It was an incredible conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And I wish you best of luck with everything that you're doing. And are you not writing your own memoir?
I have snippets. Most of what I studied in undergrad was actually counter-human trafficking strategies. And so I did, by the end of undergrad, write about 300 some odd pages. I recognized the hypocrisy of what I'm about to say, because earlier in this conversation I said, a book that's 98% done is of little value. But I do have a book in storage that's about 98% on counter-human trafficking strategies. So I've definitely done the dance of a lot of writing in the past. I might write something at some point, and I definitely have great editors to help me with that. So at least I have that in my back pocket.
That's fantastic.
Well, thank you. Perfect. Well, lovely to meet you both. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our listeners, thank you for listening, and for more conversations and more guests, please subscribe and follow us. We'll see you next week.